welcome. It's lovely to see everybody here tonight. What a wonderful turnout. Thank you for joining us. My name is Nikki Lefebvre, and I am the director of the Natick Historical Society. And I'm really delighted to be joined this evening by George Fisk of the Sherborn Historical Society and Liz Anderson of the Sherborn Library. So tonight really marks the first of what we hope will be quite a few future collaborations among Sherborn and Natick, and really our communities share such a rich history that it's a wonderful opportunity to learn about our shared past together, and we look forward to more of that. All three of our organizations, Natick and Sherborn, have deep roots dating back to the 19th century. And all institutions, all three of us, still proudly serve our communities. And so before we begin, we really want to take a moment to thank all of our supporters and community members who together help make events like these possible. And if you enjoy this program and others like it offered in Sherborn and Natick, please do consider supporting our organizations, and thank you for your consideration. So now I'm going to turn it over to Liz Anderson to say hello.
Hi there. Yeah, I just wanted to say hi and say a big thank you to Nikki and Joe. We're just so incredibly impressed by the Natick Historical Society and all that you have been putting together. It's really, you have an impressive lineup of events going on, and we're grateful to be able to join in tonight. So thank you so much for including us. The Sherborn Library and the Sherborn Historical Society have been doing some joint programming in the past. So it's really nice to be able to expand it to a neighboring community. So we really hope we can continue doing some joint programs in the future. So hopefully look forward to that. And it's just really nice to see some familiar faces here tonight. We haven't done any Zoom programs yet as a partner group where we've done them in the past in person. So it's nice to get started and try this new way of attending programs. So and I'm just really excited to hear from Professor Adelman tonight. I think it's an incredibly important topic, especially of interest right now, politics in the news. So I'm just going to introduce George Fisk, who is the president of the Sherborn Historical Society, and we'll be introducing Joe. So thank you so much.
Good. Liz, thank you so much. And I'm just going to echo sentiments that both of you have made, that certainly the Sherborn Historical Society has had a long partnership with the Sherborn Library, and we have done a number of programs together. This is sort of a different world, as we all know, with COVID and the Zoom feature, which actually I think there are some benefits to this as we're learning. But in any event, I'm absolutely delighted that we're able to have this joint program, the three institutions, and special thanks, Nikki, for having done so much work setting this up. And it's such fun to be a part of this, and I look forward to further collaborations. Now, having said all of that, I would like to introduce our speaker this evening. Joseph Adelman is an associate professor of history at Framingham State University and assistant editor for digital initiatives at the Omohundro Institute of Early American History and Culture. And if you don't know what that is, look it up, because I did, and it's fascinating. And maybe, Joe, sometime we could talk further about that. He's the author of Revolutionary Networks, The Business and Politics of Printing the News, 1763 to 1789, which received an honorable mention for the 2019 St. Louis Mercantile Library Prize from the Bibliographical Society of America. In 2019, he was elected as a member of the American Antiquarian Society. He has also written widely for public audiences and is part of the team that produces the Ben Franklin's World podcast. Now, with having said all that, I look forward to, and I suspect we all do, to listening to Joe. So Joe, it's your turn. Take it away, please.
Thank you, George, for that lovely introduction, and to Nikki and Liz for helping to sponsor this event. And Nikki, we first corresponded, like a year and a half ago about doing an in-person event in April of 2020. And I think actually thinking back to it, the funniest part is that we waited like a week or two after things closed down in the middle of March to actually cancel that event. So as George, as you noted, Zoom has made all sorts of things possible. It's a little bittersweet with this kind of local event where it would have been delightful to hop over from Framingham to Natick and do the talk in person with all of you, but that's obviously not possible right now. But hopefully things won't go too badly, and perhaps we can do some other event of some other kind in person in the future. So I'm here to talk about a revolution in the news, and I've been interested in the American Revolution for a really long time. Since I was a kid, I read Johnny Tremain 4, 7, 11. I lost track of how many times. And I'm really fortunate that I've gotten to make a career of it. So when I first got into doing research, actually as an undergraduate, I was interested in trying to understand how the revolution happened. And as I read, realized that there was something missing in how scholars talk about the revolution and talk about politics and ideology. So historians have worked on the revolution, obviously, for quite a long time. They've written about the arguments that people like Thomas Paine and John Dickinson and Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, and even people not named Thomas or John, have made about the American Revolution. But when scholars do that, they say it's really important that their work appeared in print, that it appeared in pamphlets like Common Sense or in newspaper essays. And they note, these scholars, that circulation is important, but then they stop there. That's it. They just say, it's in print, it circulates, therefore it's important. Now let me talk about this other thing that I'm interested in. It turns out, nicely for me, that something important actually does happen in that space in between politics getting written and politics getting read. That distribution, that production of print is something that's really important. And that's work that takes place inside printing offices. So on the surface, the texts that I'm going to talk about tonight appear to offer a relatively coherent argument. One of the things that print does, and perhaps you can think of things that you look at in print, is print makes things look a little more official, right? Even then, as compared to anything handwritten, even compared to if you look at the difference from a Microsoft Word document to something that's in page-ready newspaper or book format. But that obscures all the work that happens behind the scenes and before things appear in that form. So printers, the people who did that work, are, I argue, a central group of people in the revolution who exerted a significant influence on the texts and arguments and news about the revolution. And they did that often, usually through their businesses and through business practices that they'd been developing well before the revolutionary era. So in other words, when we think about the business decisions that printers were making and think about the material composition, that actually how the texts get put together, we can learn a lot about why certain arguments became popular, why certain events became more or less well-known at the time, and that all relates back to printers. But first we should take a step back, because I say printer and I know what I mean. And sometimes people in the audience know what I mean, and sometimes they don't. So who are these people? So between the 1750s and 1790s, I tracked about 750 printers who were active in the British colonies. So I included Canada and the West Indian colonies, the Caribbean colonies, in that calculation. On the socioeconomic spectrum, as a group, they're kind of in the mushy middle. That's a technical historian's term. There are the super successful. There's Benjamin Franklin way off at the end and over my shoulder. There are people who are barely in the trade long enough to even have noticed their name. Their name appears on one imprint ever, and that's the only evidence we have of their existence as part of the printing trade, or even at all. They also stand astride two very different parts of society. On the one hand, printing is manual labor. It involves physically setting pieces of text. It involves pulling the printing press to make the impressions. It's hard physical work. They are manual laborers. Their bodies show the wear of doing physical labor. Their hands are ink stained. Right, so they're in that artisanal world. At the same time, print, the production of writing often comes from elites, from ministers, from lawyers, from politicians. And so they're interacting with the elite of the social and political and religious elite of their societies, of their towns. Most of them were in fact literate. There were a few who weren't, who were setting type or working at the press without understanding what it was they were reading. That's less true by the time you get to the Revolution, though. They tended to have a pretty broad geographic view of the world. One of the things that's true about printing is that it requires a critical mass of people. You need a certain number of people to buy your newspaper, buy whatever goods. And most colonial towns, and Boston, our nearest printing town in the Revolution, is an exception to this, could only support one printer at a time. So if you were apprenticed to that printer in, say, Newport, Rhode Island, when you finished your apprenticeship and you turned 21, if you wanted to try and open your own printing shop, you had to leave Newport. And so they had a broader view. They often traveled between colonial towns for training, to take up work, to open printing offices. And that has a lot of implications down the road. One of which is that they need those contacts because they need to be able to circulate things back and forth across the colonies to generate news, to generate business this way. And so it works out well if you're a Newport printer and your former apprentice takes up a position in Alexandria, Virginia. That works out well for you because now you have a connection in Virginia to Virginia news and vice versa to get news from Rhode Island. There is one way you can stay, and that's if you marry the master's daughter and probably become his partner. Obviously, that's limited by the very practical fact of how many daughters a particular master has. But this means that there are family connections, there are cousins all over the place. There are business networks. Franklin's is the most famous. What they're printing is actually quite a lot of things in their office. Almost all of them print an almanac. That is the second best selling thing from printing shops and book selling shops. Number one is the Bible. But number two is an almanac. Everybody in America buys an almanac each year. They're then doing job printing is what the term would be. It's the equivalent of going into Staples and saying, can you run off 500 copies of this? Somebody would bring in a text and say, I'd like these printed, this sign, this whatever. And they would do that for pay. They often ran side businesses like selling books or selling stationery, things like that. And one other big thing they did is newspapers. And I want to show you an actual colonial newspaper. Well, no, I want to show you an image of a newspaper. If we were together, I could have brought a colonial newspaper, but we can't do that. So instead, I will show you this image of the Pennsylvania Journal of May 26th, 1763. If anybody happens to have read my book, this is an image from the book. So I talk about this issue in the introduction. And what I've done is it's folded out. So this is page 1, the title page, and page 4. This is how it would have been printed. Is you set the type for these two pages together because they're right on the same side of the sheet of paper. And then on the other side is the inside pages, pages 2 and 3. These were published weekly. They were like this. They were one sheet of paper folded once to make 4 pages. The paper varied a little bit in size, but the piece of paper is roughly 11 by 17 is kind of a good analog for, so it's like 2 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper put together. And for a long time, people discounted what was in newspapers, and it just looking at it, and I realized the image is small, but you can get a sense of why. It's a very miscellaneous kind of source. You can see on page 4, it's mostly advertising. On page 1, actually, this was a successful newspaper, so it also contains mostly advertising. And And then on these inside pages, pages 2 and 3, what you see is on page 2 is there's an essay to the printer. There's news from other places on the second and third column of page 2, from Savannah, Georgia, from Charleston, South Carolina, from Boston, from Newport, from New York. And then if you look very closely and very small in that first column of page 3, there's one paragraph about Philadelphia, about the place where the newspaper itself was printed. So newspapers tended to be in this era about getting news from other places. And that's simply because these places were very small. Boston at the time of the Revolution has a population of about 15,000. And so that's really not very big. If there's local news, you're literally hearing about it. It doesn't necessarily need to be in the newspaper. So the newspaper is creating news from a local spot to go elsewhere and then bringing in these news items from other places. This requires a lot of work each week to put together. The printer has to sell advertisements, obviously, to get those and set the type for those. Those usually they can sell for several newspaper issues in a row. And so what they do is they set the type once and then tie it up and set it aside. So they don't have to do that every single week. But then they have to go through a variety of sources to get the rest of this newspaper. And they go through 3 main categories. Number 1, what I'm just calling oral reports. They literally talk to people. So visitors or travelers, sailors, people who are passengers on recently arrived vessels will get off the ship and go into the coffee house or the tavern or the printing office and say, here's what was happening in Bristol when we left 6 weeks ago. Or here's what was happening in Boston when we left a week and a half ago. And now that we're in Philadelphia, let me get you up to date on that. They would publish official proclamations, all sorts of manner of things. They reproduce some handwritten reports. So occasionally somebody would walk in with a letter. Printers also had connections with the post office. They often tried to be the postmaster in their town because you had to go to the post office to get your material, to get your letters. And so you'd stand there, you'd open it up. And if you were a businessman with connections in London, they would send you a letter, and then there might be a paragraph in the middle about some debate in Parliament. And if you were lucky as a printer, that merchant would say, hey, I've got this paragraph about London politics. And then they'd pull that and put that in the newspaper as news from London, an extract of a letter from a gentleman in London, something like that, that they'd produce news that way. And then they'd look at other newspapers. Those items that I mentioned from other towns were literally pulled from another newspaper. And I've gone through, I don't have it literally right in front of me, but I've gone through and you can track exactly which newspaper those other news items come. This is the rough equivalent would be, it's a news aggregator. So it's like the Associated Press. It's kind of like a wire service or using a Twitter feed or something to gather news today in a little more technologically savvy way. They're doing all of this every single week. Most of the decisions they make have no political import whatsoever, right? They're just looking to put together 4 pages, and actually usually 2.5-ish, depending on exactly how much advertising they've sold. During the Revolution, that starts to take on a lot of political value. If you're getting multiple newspaper reports from Boston about a riot, which one do you print? That makes a difference in what the people in New York reading your newspaper are going to think of what's going on in Boston. Which letter do you reproduce? Do you reproduce letters from somebody who's sympathetic to the American cause or somebody who's not, right? Each of these decisions that they've been making all the time now have huge political import and huge political value. Let me show you one very small example of what I'm talking about. So this is duplicates of the same paragraph. You are not seeing double. On the left side, next to the blue, is an item from the New Jersey Journal of July 11, 1781, printed by Shepard Culloch in Chatham, New Jersey, not far from where the Continental Army was encamped. And it's a nice little paragraph about a British and French naval encounter in the Caribbean that the French won. According to this news story, it was printed in the New Jersey Journal That copy of the newspaper was sent to Worcester, Massachusetts, where Isaiah Thomas was printing a newspaper called the Massachusetts Spy. He read it. He marked it. That's his pen, marking that to his journeymen and apprentices to copy that into the next Massachusetts Spy. But he added something, and it's really hard to read. It was okay when I saw it in person at the Antiquarian Society out in Worcester. It's hard to read on the image. It says, "This account wants confirmation." And we know that because on the other side is what it looks like when it gets into the Massachusetts Spy, and it adds that bracketed italicized phrase, "This account wants confirmation." I have no idea. There is no evidence for why Thomas wanted to print this, but wanted to add this caveat. But what he did in this very, very small decision, he may not even have thought about it for more than a minute or two, is he identified the paragraph and so reproduced it for his audience in Worcester and for anyone else further down the line who got copies of his newspaper, but turned this straightforward factual account of a battle into something that was a rumor, into something that we weren't sure about. We want you to know about this, but we're not sure. And so it's a very small example, which is why I don't have further evidence for it. But these kinds of decisions made over the course of months and years compound to create large-scale changes in political practices, in the kinds of politics that become popular and of interest to people. So I want to take you through a couple of historical examples of that. First, by talking about the Stamp Act. I love talking about the Stamp Act. For those of you who don't recall from school and haven't taken any of my classes recently, the Stamp Act was passed in early 1765, and it said that as of November 1st, 1765, every printed paper would be required to carry a stamp and pay it on which a tax had been paid. And that included everything from newspapers, almanacs, books, pamphlets, to things like mortgages, indenture forms, bills of lading, marriage licenses. They put the tax on playing cards and dice, like everything. They got everything. So something interesting happens when you attack the people who are in charge of communicating news. They fight back and they use their media to do it. So in most of the 13 colonies, rather, the act did not take effect, but it did in what I will uncharitably call the other 13 colonies. So in the various provinces in Canada and the various Caribbean islands. So we actually have some examples. This is a Barbados Mercury from 1766 with the stamp down in the lower right corner. You could buy pre-stamped paper if you were going to print a newspaper or something like that that had already been stamped. These are imprints. They're ink and print or embossed like a notary form, not lick 'em and stick 'em stamps, or as my kids know, sticker and stick 'em stamps. So printers reacted by doing the things that they do. They first heard the news and they decided to try to make some money off of it. So they printed pamphlet editions of the act. They advertised in their newspapers to say, we're printing our almanacs early because the tax takes effect in November when usually you'd be buying your almanac for next year. We're going to sell them to you in August and September. Get them now before the price goes up. And then they also did, as I briefly hinted at in my in letting the slide get away from me, they used their newspapers themselves as vehicles of protest. So this is an example again of the Pennsylvania Journal. It's a famous one. You can find images of it all over the internet. Published on October 31st, 1765. So this is designed to be the day before the Stamp Act takes effect, not for Halloween. But you can see if you look at it, the printer, William Bradford, has designed the front page of his newspaper to look like a gravestone with the skull and crossbones, with the black borders. It's hard to read on the image, but along the side, it reads, "Adieu, adieu to the liberty of the press." In the lower right corner, where in the Barbados Mercury you saw the stamp, you see another skull and crossbones. I've got a closer up image of that with the label, "An emblem of the effects of the stamp." And if that doesn't get you, you turn over to page 4, where the advertising is, and they've got this little advertising with an epitaph for the newspaper, which departed this life the 31st of October of a stamp in her vitals, aged 23 years. So they anthropomorphize their newspapers. They actually hold mock funerals for their newspapers, for the freedom of the press, marching through the streets of towns. They treat them as if they're dying and publishing the way that they would have for other prominent figures in their community. And they're circulating news about this. So one of the reasons why the Pennsylvania Journal does this is that they're hearing about other printers making similar kinds of protests and also shutting down their newspapers as part of their protest. And other newspapers then follow suit using identical language to the journal and reproducing some of these images, the skull and crossbones, things like that. The other part of anthropomorphizing, of making it as if the paper is a person, is that you get my favorite story. This is really important that it's my favorite story, but it just gives you a good example of what all of this means for people. In Boston, in New York and Philadelphia, through the winter, the Stamp Act has not taken effect. So in those towns, no one is producing anything in print with stamps on them. But there are other colonies that are. And so things sometimes show up with the stamp on them, right? Like those copies of a newspaper might get on a ship in Bridgetown, Barbados, and show up in Charleston, South Carolina. In February of 1766, such a piece of paper, I think it was a customs pass or something like that. It's not entirely clear from the news stories, which I'll talk about obviously in a second. Such a piece of paper shows up in Boston. The good people of Boston, being the law-abiding, process-oriented folks that they were, arrested the piece of paper for violating the British Constitution, violating the rights of the people, violating Magna Carta. They marched the piece of paper through the streets of Boston, put the piece of paper on trial. It's been charged with a crime, so they convene a jury. They hold a trial for this piece of paper with a stamp on it. The jury deliberates for 2 hours. Probably should have mentioned that all this time they're sitting in a tavern. So that's part of this. That is part of the story. The jury, as you might suspect, finds the stamp and the paper guilty of all of its crimes and sentences it to death. So they take the piece of paper and they march it through the streets again to the Liberty Tree in the South End. They hang it with effigies of George Grenville, who's essentially the prime minister who had written the Stamp Act, and with Lord Bute, who was the favorite advisor of George III. And then they burn the three of them, the two effigies and the piece of paper. And then, the reason I know about this, they write about it in the newspaper. And they put this image in the newspaper. I love this image with the piece of paper. And Bute, he was Scottish, so I'm assuming that he's on the left with the kilt. And George Grenville. And who's holding the piece of paper but the devil? This is a very, very rare image. I've shown you a couple through. Most colonial newspapers have very little imagery, except for what we would call stock imagery. So it's expensive and time consuming to make. This would have been a woodcut, somebody literally carving into a piece of wood. So usually you have things that you can use again and again. A skull and crossbones, a coffin, a horse, a ship. They're very generic kinds of images and very sparse. This was done very specifically for this specific issue of this specific newspaper. So it's a very special thing to get to see. And it brings to life, brings out both my energy and the kind of importance that they gave to the pieces of paper, the kind of threat that they saw to their ideas, to the existence of print as a means of communicating through the Stamp Act. Now, they are fortunate in that they are able to thwart the Stamp Act. Parliament repeals the Stamp Act, and so the tax is lifted, the ports reopen, some courts so ports with a P and courts with a C had both closed in some colonies, those reopen. Protests continue, practices develop. Because this is a talk, I'm fast forwarding to the next big event, and especially the next Boston event, which is the Boston Tea Party. And to give you another example of how this works and how well developed these communication networks get by 1773. So if you recall, at the end of November of 1773, 3 tea ships arrive in Boston Harbor. A fourth one, which a lot of people, I didn't know about until I was a grown-up and a professional historian. There was a fourth one headed for Boston that shipwrecked off Cape Cod. I grew up in New York. Maybe people in Massachusetts learned about this. I don't know. My son hasn't gotten to that yet, my oldest. To enforce the Tea Act, which required colonists to buy only British East India Company tea. It actually lowered the tax on tea as part of forcing them to buy the specific tea, but also increased the enforcement of customs duties. People had been smuggling in what they considered better Dutch tea, led by everyone's hero, John Hancock. So there's a standoff on the evening of December 16th. A group of tradesmen, among whom would have been a number of printers, printers' apprentices, journeymen, with their faces blackened with soot, dump 340 chests of tea into Boston Harbor. They had set up communication networks to deal with this. Immediately, they put Paul Revere on a horse. Always feel bad for the horse. And sent him to New York and Philadelphia with the news. Now, in ordinary course, it takes about 2 weeks for news to get from Boston to Philadelphia in the 1770s. That was before they had I-95, when now it takes 3 weeks. He arrives, in this case, in 8 days. And actually, now I think about it, a little less than that, because he leaves the night of December 16th. He gets there in the morning of December 24th, walks straight to the printing office, and hands over a bunch of materials that our friend William Bradford turns into this one-side, one-off piece that he calls a Christmas box for the customers of the Pennsylvania Journal. Now, this looks coherent, right? Let me peel back the layers for you a little bit and show you how the networks are working. So first, I'll circle two of these chunks of text in red. Those chunks of text come from the Massachusetts Spy of the morning of December 16th, 1773. So Isaiah Thomas's newspaper, he was in Boston before Lexington and Concord, then he moved to Worcester. He printed his newspaper on that Thursday morning, and Revere carried it with him to Philadelphia. So Bradford had access to that. It's a description of the town meeting and the ship owner and the governor going back and forth about what to do about these ships and the tea. And some resolutions. Lexington, the town of Lexington, vowed not to drink any tea. So bully for Lexington. All of this comes from a newspaper. The second piece, which I hope you can see is highlighted in green down in the lower right corner, is headed New York. He reproduced, Bradford did, a letter, a handwritten note written from the Boston Committee of Correspondence, which is a group of men organized to do exactly what it sounds like they were supposed to do, that they'd written to New Yorkers about the event and giving them information. And then the last, which is highlighted in yellow, is these two boxes, one lower end of the first column and then the top of the second column. There is no evidence of this particular account of the Boston Tea Party. It's an actual account of what happened. And there's no evidence, and I've looked, anywhere else. So newspapers tended to be printed on similar days. So in Boston, newspapers were printed on Thursdays and then on Mondays. By the time the next newspapers were printed on Monday, while Revere was in transit, already way further south, this account has changed a little bit. What I think this is Paul Revere's account walking into the print shop and saying to Bradford, here's what happened Thursday night. And so what this single document shows is how organized they were. The printers, the politicians through these committees of correspondence, and these various media for communication, oral, print, manuscript, in bringing together information and making it appear coherent. And as you can see, they even separated out the information from the newspaper and the oral account in a way that makes it seem more coherent. The war starts a year and a half later at Lexington. They're able to do this same thing when the Battle of Lexington occurs. So some of you may have heard of the Lexington Alarm Letter. One of the copies of it is at the Revolution Museum, the Masonic Museum out in Lexington. There's also a copy that was sent to Philadelphia that's in Philadelphia, which is the one I looked at, and pulled all of this information of the writer, and I'm assuming actually several writers, because it was pretty much nonstop following. They essentially follow Route 20 out to Worcester, and then the route of 395 down to Norwich and New London, Connecticut, and then US Route 1, the Post Road, down through New York City and to Philadelphia to bring news about the Battle of Lexington. This was sent at 10 o'clock in the morning from Watertown. It's a very sketchy account. It's a few hours later. We know that shots have been fired. We know they're still marching. We're gathering, send help. It's in fancier 18th century language, but that's essentially what it is. And so you can track this as it goes. If you can hear crying in the background, that's because it's bedtime. And there's only so much we can do about that. You can follow the tracks of the writer, and then on the next table, you can track the newspapers following just a few days behind, either printing special editions. So in Norwich, they do that. In New York, it's printed in several points. And this news, as I said, it usually takes 2 weeks to get from Boston to Philadelphia. This news has gotten to Williamsburg, Virginia in just 10, is how fast and how rapid they're moving it through these networks, that they're all printing the same letter and reproducing it from one another's newspapers. In this case, because it's the same text, it's a little harder to trace exactly which newspaper each of them used, but they're clearly reproducing it from these sources. The war then wreaks havoc on the printing trade. It's terrible for printers. They are political targets because they deal in politics. And so there's this separation between patriot and loyalist printers. The patriots stay where the Continental Army is, the loyalists stay where the British Army is. After the war, many of the loyalist printers leave, actually in a far higher proportion than the loyalist population generally, and they seek employment elsewhere. And the one I want to tell you a little bit about is a woman named Margaret Draper, who's a member of the Green family. This is one of those big family networks where in the 1760s, they have printers from as far north as Portsmouth, New Hampshire, all the way down to Williamsburg. They're focused on New England. They go all the way back to the very first printers who worked at Harvard College in Cambridge in the 1640s. Draper was a loyalist. Her husband, Richard Draper, who was also a member of the Green family, printed a loyalist newspaper until his death in 1774. She then took up that newspaper, the Boston Newsletter, and continued to print it until the evacuation of Boston in March of 76, when she left and went to London with the British soldiers. And then she spent the next 10 years petitioning for compensation. And the British, after the war, set up a claims commission to compensate American loyalists for their losses. And so we have these great files. If you have access to Ancestry.com, they're National Archives of the United Kingdom files, but Ancestry.com, if you have access to an account, has all of them that you can go read. And they're these amazing documents that if there are any grad students listening, like, work on them. They're great projects in there where they write narratives about their losses. They give, this is a schedule of property and income. They have letters of recommendation. And Draper has this long narrative talking about how her husband was such a devoted adherent to the crown and how she picked up that mantle and how she drew opposition because of that. She had recommendation letters from General Thomas Gage, who was the commander who sent troops out to Lexington and Concord, from the Oliver family, who were loyalists in Boston and administration imperial officials in Massachusetts. And so we can calculate losses with, a hair taken off for exaggeration. She never got quite, she claimed thousands of pounds of losses. She and her surviving daughter were able to get 60 pounds per year as an allowance, not very much at all. The remaining printers, some loyalists did stay behind. My favorite of those is James Johnston in Savannah, who had been forced to leave at the start of the Revolution, came back when Savannah was occupied by the British, then left again and had his property confiscated by the state of Georgia government. He had gone to the Bahamas. And then at the end of the war, they asked him to come back because nobody else wanted to go to Savannah to print. And he agreed because he wanted his property back. So they made nice, and he became the state printer of Georgia in Savannah. Others, sorry, got ahead of myself. Printers then became important parts of creating the nation after the Revolutionary War. And this is where I'm going to close, including immigrant printers, many of them are actually from England and from Ireland, such as Matthew Carey, who immigrated in 1785. He was a notorious printer in Dublin. He was a Catholic printer in Dublin, printing opposition to the British. So he went to Philadelphia. He happened to travel on the same ship as some guy named the Marquis de Lafayette. I don't know if you've heard of Lafayette. He fought for the Continental Army, right? He was Washington's aide. He listens to Carey's story for weeks on end as they're traveling and writes him a check for $400 to help start his printing business, which he does. And then Lafayette does him an even bigger favor and gets him the endorsement of General George Washington. There is no human being on the planet, I mean, maybe Oprah, who is as broadly popular in the United States today as George Washington was in the 1780s. That he got George Washington through making these kinds of connections and trying to use these connections then to get subscribers to his newspaper that he started. This example that I'm showing on the screen now is a letter that Washington wrote in support of a magazine that Carey started in the 1780s called the American Museum. So like Carey, a lot of the younger generation of printers that came into the trade after the war, they took far bolder stances than the printers who had experienced the imperial crisis. Benjamin Franklin, who was still alive and living in Philadelphia, was appalled at this. His own grandson was one of the leading proponents of this kind of political journalism. But the younger printers they became centers in the 1790s. This is beyond my project, but I'm happy to talk about it a little bit, of the first political parties. They strongly supported the Constitution. They took the lead in grand processions. There were these parades to celebrate ratification. So fresh off their influential role in the imperial crisis and the revolution, printers established themselves as key nodes in the information networks of the new republic. Congress agreed in part by setting up the post office structure as a means for circulating information through newspapers, much more than as a means for circulating mail between individuals. And by the 1790s, as I said, they're using those networks to create what we talk about as some of the first political parties. And they were doing that through the exact same networks that they had been building and developing and the practices they had been using since the 1760s. Thank you all for talking. I'm going to put up for just a moment. I'm happy to take questions. I hope Nikki has some questions. If you wanted to email me a question, you can jot down my email address. If you're on Twitter and want to follow me there, you can do that. If you are looking for things to put on your Zoom bookshelf, I will speak highly of the cover design folks at Johns Hopkins Press. They did a wonderful job with the cover. The inside's okay too.
Thank you, Joe. I just, from all of us here, I want to offer a warm but silent Zoom round of applause. So thank you very much for that wonderful presentation. Before we begin our Q&A session, I want to offer thanks again to community supporters who make programs like this one possible to offer for free. And if you enjoyed this program, I want to encourage you to make a donation to your local historical society in Sherborn or Natick and your local library.